Hello everyone. My topic is on why we should reform our prison system. Should a person be sentenced to prison for having a few grams of marijuana? Well, millions of inmates sit in jail day after day doing nothing beneficial with their lives. We are paying for inmates who may or may not have a legitimate reason to be there. Drug offenders, for example, are housed among murderers and other violent criminals. Furthermore, the United States imprisons its citizens in greater numbers than any other country. Mass incarceration harms the poor and people of color disproportionately, and it does not make us safer. For the sake of taxpayer resources, it is critical that we reform the way prisons are run and increase the inmate productivity so that when they are released, they are ready to be productive members of society with the confidence to achieve new goals through restoring overcrowded prisons, making mandatory sentencing laws fair, and to combat the racism that lingers in the criminal justice system. On to the first issue, prison overcrowding. One of the major contributors to poor jail conditions is overcrowding. According to statistics, our prison population has risen to unprecedented heights, with 2.3 million Americans currently incarcerated and another 5 million on parole or probation. These figures indicate that 1 out of every 31 adults will end up in prison, which is a greater rate than most other countries. The issue here is that non-violent offenders make up the vast bulk of individuals behind bars. Some attribute jail overpopulation to a number of factors include mass incarceration as a result of false drug accusations. The war on drugs resulted in tougher drug laws, resulting in a 1,200% increase in the number of convicted drug offenders between 1980 and 2018, with the majority of offenders being driven by mental illnesses or drug addiction concerns. According to the Penal Reform International, overcrowding is a result of our criminal justice practices rather than a cause of increased crime. We can combat this issue by sending fewer people to prison, by directing prosecutors to send fewer drug cases to federal court. The Justice Department hopes to ensure that fewer people spend years in prison for nonviolent drug offenses. Secondly, allow drug offenders to have their sentences reduced. A recent bill introduced by senators will reduce the required prison sentences by half. Lastly, for participating in a drug rehabilitation program, inmates should get a year off their sentence. These are one of many ways we can help solve this issue and reform our prisons one step at a time. Now that I've addressed this issue and how we can solve it, on to the next issue, mandatory sentencing laws. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws are another contributing factor that needs to be addressed. The underlying issue with mandatory minimum sentencing laws are that minor drug offenses are being treated as major crimes. Prosecutors are taking advantage of this by threatening defendants to accept a guilty plea which would send them to prison. Federal drug laws have the highest potential punishments of any crime, with certain terms ranging from 40 years to life in prison for substantial amounts of drugs. Even small amounts of drugs can result in years in prison. But the main issue is the discriminatory punishment for drugs that disproportionately affect lower income people. One method to modify mandatory minimum sentences is to eliminate them entirely. Whether this may be repealing them or striking them out of the federal code. Repealing mandatory minimum penalties would not allow judges complete and unrestricted discretion in sentencing. Without obligatory minimums, federal courts would still have to apply to federal sentencing guidelines to determine the prison sentences, as they do in all federal criminal cases. Finally, the last issue is racism in the prison system. Racism in the prison system is atrociously evident. In the U.S., individuals of color are incarcerated at higher rates in state and federal prison. If we were to compare the identical crime committed by two people of the two different races to put these figures in context, according to the American Civil Liberties Union, a person of color is 3.73 times more likely than any other individual to be arrested for marijuana possession, despite the fact that both races use marijuana at similar rates. Furthermore, stop and frisk statistics, for example, suggest that approximately 3% of these encounters result in any proof of a crime. As a result, more than 97% of these people are being punished purely because they are members of a group that statistically commits certain crimes at a higher rate. That should be a source of concern for us. This is an issue that has been going on forever and it is in need of reform. Actions we must take to combat this issue are to collect demographic data on their activities, such as how many arrests are made, how many charges are filed, how many cases are referred to diversion programs, and how far their attempt to eradicate racial inequities in the system have progressed. Next, we must stop police officers who racially profile people from being prosecuted. Racial profiling is clearly unconstitutional and it violates the U.S. Constitution's essential provision of equal protection under the law of all citizens. It is time you hold police officers and the criminal justice system accountable for their actions. All in all, by working together, we can help reform our prisons by solving the overcrowded prison issue, making mandatory minimum sentences fair, and most importantly, fighting against racism by holding police officers and criminal justice system accountable. Now that I've conveyed my points on why our prison is in need of reform, will you help join the cause?